This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Hindus in Focus podcast. I'm Zubeda Hamid, your host for today. For the past couple of months, the news has been filled with headlines about Delhi's toxic air. Air quality levels deteriorated so sharply that a number of emergency measures had to be put in place, from shutting down schools to halting construction activity, just to bring the levels down from very poor to poor. But apart from the many respiratory issues that residents of Delhi, NCR, and other parts of India face due to breathing in polluted air, did you know that air pollution could also lead to heart disease? One study indicates that outdoor air pollution from all sources accounts for 2.18 million deaths per year in India, of which 30% are attributable to heart disease. As pollution levels rise across the country and the burden of heart disease, especially among the young, grows in India, we speak to Dr. K. Srinath Reddy, cardiologist and distinguished professor of public health of the Public Health Foundation of India, about the links between air pollution, heart disease, and how this can be tackled. Good morning and welcome to the Hindus in Focus podcast, Dr. Srinath Reddy.
Glad to be with you and with your listeners.
Thank you. Doctor, let's just start with some basic background. Could you explain the link between air pollution and heart disease to us?
We know that heart disease is of very many kinds, but the principal one we are very much concerned is what we call coronary heart disease, where the blood vessels which supply blood to the heart are diseased, and when they actually do not supply the required amount of blood to the heart muscle suffers damage, which, if it is temporary, lasting only for a few minutes, we call it angina. If it lasts for a much longer time and actually damages the heart muscle in a permanent manner, we call it a heart attack. And when the heart muscle stops functioning properly and the heart becomes weak as a pump, then we call it heart failure. And then, of course, there can be death related to a heart attack, which can be because of the complications of the heart attack, or it could come on even very suddenly at the beginning of the heart attack, which we call sudden cardiac death. So, these are some of the challenges that we have with heart disease. But when we really talk about heart disease, we are talking about the heart and the blood vessels. So, the entire circulatory system. So we have other elements also which are involved because of pollution, not just the blood vessels of the heart, but also the blood vessels of the brain, which can result in a stroke, paralytic stroke. And that can be, again, very severely disabling or even can lead to a fatal outcome. We can have also uh, clots in the blood vessels of the legs and the pelvis, and they can travel to the lungs and cause what's called pulmonary embolism, which can again be very fatal. Then you can have electrical disturbances in the heart called arrhythmias. Those are very important as well. And then, of course, pollution can also cause diabetes, and that itself can damage blood vessels and can lead to heart attacks. So that's an indirect pathway. So there are very many ways in which pollution actually affects the heart. And we have been seeing that the number of heart disease incidents that have been rising in the past few years could be clearly related to the rising levels of air pollution. And this is much more in the months of winter, but also even around the rest of the year as well, because even what are considered to be relatively lower levels of pollution than the winter levels are also fairly high, and continuous exposure to moderate to high levels of pollution can be severely damaging to the blood vessels.
Explain to us, doctor, what happens when you breathe in toxic air. PM 2.5 has been particularly linked with these diseases that you mentioned, correct? Heart disease, stroke, and diabetes.
Well, there are very many chemicals in the polluted air. It's a toxic mix of many chemicals, a chemical cocktail, if you will. But particulate matter, PM 2.5, which is a very small size. In fact, there are particulate matters which are called ultrafine particulate matter, which are even smaller, about 1.5 microns. And there are bigger particulate matter, which is about 10 microns. But what we are really most concerned is about the particulate matter at about 2.5. And when these come up in a very big way in air pollution, because multiple sources of pollution produce it, particularly any combustible material produces PM 2.5, unlike road dust, which is much more like PM 10. Now, this PM 2.5 can get into the lungs, and because it's very small, it can go through the lung tissue into the capillaries that are supplying blood to the lungs. And from there, it enters the general bloodstream. And therefore, it can reach any and every organ in the body. And PM 2.5 is very irritating to the lining of the blood vessels. It causes inflammation. And the inflamed blood vessels can also then start developing a breach in the inner fine lining of the blood vessels, which is called the endothelium. There can be endothelial dysfunction, even otherwise, that the blood vessels fail to dilate properly. But more importantly, when you have the breach in the blood vessels lining, then the fat that is circulating in the body starts getting deposited there. Equally importantly, and perhaps even more importantly, is that this particulate matter can also precipitate clotting in the blood vessels by activating the blood cells which are responsible for clotting. That's called the platelets. They also activate the coagulation proteins. So, by two pathways, they actually activate the clotting mechanism. Now, you have a breach in the fine lining of the blood vessel, and then on top of that breach, you have the fats depositing, and then you also have the blood cells which are responsible for clotting getting activated. It's a very fertile ground for a large clot to form. And therefore, you can get a sudden heart attack because the blood stops flowing in the blood vessel because of this clot, which has happened over the breach in the blood vessel lining, and the activated platelets form that big clot. So, therefore, we are very worried about sudden cardiac death, heart attacks, and if it happens in the brain strokes. So, those are important elements. In addition, because the PM 2.5 and ozone are particularly irritant, they can also cause electrical arrhythmias. They can The electrical conduction system of the heart can get irritated, and they can cause electrical disturbances, and what we call arrhythmias. They can also be life threatening. Over time, they can also cause heart muscle disease. And as I said, if the clots are formed in the brain, you get strokes. If you get clots in the legs or pelvis, they travel to the lungs, you get pulmonary embolism. So these are the chemicals which are actually irritating the blood vessels, causing inflammation and leading to blood clotting. And that is where the setting for heart attacks takes place.
Are we all breathing in PM 2.5 day in and day out?
Yes, we are, unfortunately, because as I said, these are all coming from emissions, whether it's automobile exhaust or wood fuel burning or crop waste burning. All of these are actually contributing to our PM 2.5 at very high levels. And add to that, of course, you have construction dust, but that's mostly PM10. But as I said, the emissions that are coming in air pollution are not only restricted to PM 2.5 and ozone, though they're the main culprits causing all this damage. But you also have what are called polycyclic aromatic compounds. And then you have nitrogen dioxide, you have oxides of sulfur, and all of this toxic cocktail mix of chemicals can be very damaging in terms of blood vessel integrity and can cause heart attacks.
Are microplastics also part of this pollution that we're breathing in? There's been a lot of talk recently at COP29.
Yes, microplastics are a challenge. Microplastics come in through water, come in through food, also can come in through inhaled air. it does come in, but the other routes like food and water are principally the sources of microplastics. Even ultra processed foods, it's been recently published that many of the ultra processed foods are also wrapped in plastic material, and the microplastics get into the food material. And once you consume these packaged foods, then the microplastics get into your body. And the microplastics have been found in the placenta of women who have delivered, and even in the brains of, fetuses who are stillborn for some reason. So the fact is, these microplastics can penetrate every organ in the body, including the placenta, can affect the child, can affect, of course, all of us through a very irritant mechanism and cause a lot of damage.
Talk to us a little bit, Doctor, about whether air pollution is an urban and outdoor phenomenon as is generally thought of, or do you think that it is also a rural phenomenon and indoor air pollution is also a concern?
Indoor air pollution is particularly of high concern in countries of South Asia and Sub Saharan Africa, and even some other parts of Africa, because for long women have been used to cooking at home with biofuels or biomass fuels, usually firewood. And the kind of combustible material that is used produces, whether it is wood or dung cakes, biofuels, they actually produce a lot of smoke. And there is in that smoke also a lot of PM 2.5, and of course other materials like ozone and oxides of nitrogen and sulfur. But these noxious materials, especially PM 2.5, can penetrate into the lungs and cause a lot of damage, even for the woman who is cooking in the kitchen. And we have known that not only lung disease, but now heart disease too, in these women is attributable to the inhalation of kitchen smoke. And not just the lady who is cooking in the kitchen, but also the babe in her arms, the toddler who is playing around her. All of them are subjected to this kitchen's curse of air pollution from biomass fuels. And also, we know that in cold winters, we have people even in the villages burning hay and burning wood in order to keep themselves warm, and often through fires which are lit in the courtyard of the houses or outdoor. But all the thick smoke also enters the lungs. So it's not as though rural folk are immune from it. We are seeing a fair amount of air pollution, not only from automobile transport because of buses and tractors going, but also because of this indoor air pollution because of cooking fuels.
Who is most vulnerable, Doctor? Is it the elderly, the very young, or is it the working age population who probably breathes it in more while going to and from work? Or is it everybody who is vulnerable to this?
It is everybody, because every human body has blood vessels, every human body has lungs, every human body has heart and other organs, which are all vulnerable. But if you're asking who is more vulnerable among all of these, certainly the elderly are the most vulnerable, because their blood vessels are already generally somewhat diseased and less capable of dilatation. And if there is a damage to their blood vessels, then if there's a lot of endothelial dysfunction, endothelial disruption, and clot formation, they're much more likely to get heart attacks and brain strokes. And it's also likely that the period of their exposure over many years has been high, and the cumulative exposure also takes a toll on the blood vessels. And usually, as age advances, other risk factors of heart disease also come in. Your blood pressure goes up, your blood lipids may be high, your glucose tolerance is reduced, and you may be pre diabetic or diabetic. And all of these form the background against which air pollution causes further damage to the blood vessels and suddenly springs a clot. And therefore, the elderly are the most vulnerable. But again, Young children are very vulnerable, especially if pregnant women are exposed to this. High levels of air pollution, the little baby growing in the womb, the baby that's just been born, their reserve is very little and they are extremely vulnerable too. So at both extremes of age, there is much greater vulnerability. But nobody is immune. All through our life course, if we are exposed for a prolonged period of pollution, then our blood vessels are going to really start protesting. Initially, with loss of endothelial vasodilatation, so that they lose their capacity for elasticity and dilatation, then through damage to the inner lining of the blood vessels, then through development of plaques which start blocking the blood supply, then the disruption of the plaques which form clots, and that suddenly leads to heart attacks and strokes. So virtually everybody is vulnerable, but we have to be very, very careful about how much elderly people expose themselves or young babies are exposed to air pollution.
Talk to us a little bit about the current scenario in India, Doctor. You mentioned a little earlier that there has been an uptick in cases when it comes to heart disease. How much do we know about this? For instance, does the Delhi and NCR regions see a higher trend in heart disease, say, over the past decade than other parts of the country? Are there any links or research that we know of?
Yes, actually, a lot of research has been done over the last 10, 15 years in different parts of the country. And we know that initially people did not know how much exposure to air pollution, even after all the other factors are adjusted, are responsible for hypertension. The more exposed to air pollution, if you are living in parts of the city in Delhi which are much more close to emissions from industrial areas, then your blood pressure levels are much higher than if you are living in a green area. Similarly, diabetes rates are also higher among people who are much more exposed to pollution. And the lungs are, of course, damaged, but the blood vessels are damaged. And that means that people who are living in areas which are highly polluted in Delhi are much more likely to get heart attacks and have been shown to have much higher levels of heart attacks than people living in green areas of Delhi. So this has been shown here. This has been shown in other parts of India as well. So the better ventilated the area, the greener the area, and less smoky the area, the risk of air pollution and risk of heart disease as a result of that pollution is much less. Whereas more congested the housing locality, more smoke filled that area from emissions from cars or other sources of emissions, including indoor emissions. There, and less greenery, much less greenery. These are the areas where you will get much greater levels of cumulative exposure to air pollution and likelihood of heart attacks and brain strokes.
Would you say this is also linked with an increasing number of younger persons getting heart disease?
Yes, of course, because the young generally are supposed to have healthy blood vessels. But apart from the fact that health are now, young people are acquiring other risk factors because of smoking, overweight, obesity, eating a lot of ultra processed foods, all of which are damaging the blood vessels. But exposure to air pollution, particularly if they're going to be commuting a fair amount on the roads where there's a lot of exposure to automobile exhaust fumes, and they are likely to be much more likely to get more damage to the blood vessels. Therefore, what we see as naturally healthy blood vessels among young people are no longer there. The blood vessels are already getting damaged in their teenage years or even before that. And they're likely to get heart attacks at a young age if they're prone to be exposed. If your blood vessels are having atherosclerotic plaques, they're not causing any trouble usually at that level. They're not blocking the blood supply. So you're unaware of it. But you're exposed to a huge amount of air pollution, and that plaque cracks open in the blood vessel lining. Then the fatty core inside is exposed. And that triggers a big clot formation in that blood vessel, and the blood circulation in that blood vessel gets sealed off. And if that happens in the blood vessel supplying the heart muscle, you get a heart attack and you can get a sudden cardiac death. So that's where young people are particularly prone if you're actually getting exposed to a lot of automobile exhaust pollution or other forms of pollution. And if you're a smoker, God help you, because you're also getting pollution through that source.
Right. Quickly, doctor, is there a difference between short term and long term exposure?
Well, long term exposure also causes lung damage to the blood vessels. It insidiously damages the lining of the blood vessels, creates the background for formation of plaques, etc. But the sudden exposure actually triggers the rupture of the plaque and the heart attack. And therefore, both are dangerous. And it's important for us even to avoid long term exposure, because it's going to continuously build up blood vessel pathology, which can be then triggered by an acute increase in the amount of exposure.
Last question, doctor. What we know that, of course, the Supreme Court has put in place certain measures for Delhi and NCR, but as a country, what would you say that the policies that are required to mitigate pollution, and at an individual level, what can people do?
Well, as a country, it's very important that we reduce the amount of fossil fuel consumption, and ensure that at least the kind of factories, etc., which are emitting a lot of smoke are located well outside the boundaries of the city, somewhere outside and the outskirts of the city, so that the pollution in the city itself is much less. We have to make sure that the automobile congestion is much less, and the kind of fuels that are used in the automobiles are also less likely to be yielding a lot of polluting material. We ought to ensure that we build up much more amount of greenery in our cities, because fortunately the trees are there to help us. They absorb a lot of this material which comes in from polluted emissions. And if we can actually increase the amount of greenery, the pollution levels go down. And certainly, we must ensure that as much of ventilation is available in housing as possible, because air should be blowing freely so that we do not get a lot of polluted air accumulating all the time for people to breathe and choke. Certainly, indoor cooking must not be done with biofuels like wood and cow dung cakes. That is something that people must avoid, and that is where the government policies will help in making sure that LPG and other natural gas is available in an affordable rate, so that people are not dependent upon for this kind of fuels, the biofuels. At the same time, if people are vulnerable to disease, and especially at the extremes of age, or if they have a background of already pre-existing disease, they should avoid going out into polluted environments. They should go out either rather early in the morning or late in the evening, when there is not so much of pollution around. And if they have to go out, they should rather wear a mask. And a 95 mask usually filters out PM 2.5 quite effectively. So they should wear a mask. Those who are vulnerable to the health effects of pollution because of pre-existing disease or because of extremes of age, particularly elderly people, should protect themselves by either not moving in polluted environments or wearing an N95 mask. That's important. But also because part of the problem arises from blood clotting, and quite often the temperatures are high. Even now, even preceding the winter months, they can be fairly high. People should take a fair amount of water, so that the tendency for blood clotting actually is markedly reduced. So these are some of the precautions that ought to be taken. But the fundamental thing is we must try and reduce the emissions, even as we protect ourselves through the other methods.
Thank you so much for speaking to us today, doctor.
Most welcome.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.